Would you pray with me? Creator God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. I remember the first time I saw the ocean. I was filled with awe. I grew up in South St. Louis, as most of you are aware, and as a South St. Louisan, the Mississippi River was always a constant companion. We would take trips on the Admiral and the other excursion boats. We'd visit the Arch. We'd spend time on the Cleves Landing, all on the banks of the Mississippi. I had friends that lived close to the Mississippi, and we even used to hang out at a park that had an overlook viewing the great muddy river. That river was a part of my life growing up. But here I was at the Atlantic Ocean, a body of water very unlike the Mississippi. For one thing, I couldn't see Illinois on the other side. For that matter, I couldn't see any other side. The expanse stretched on forever. It was an awe-filled moment. My life has been filled with such moments, often surrounding majestic examples of God's creation, such as visiting the ocean or mountains. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but from the pictures I have seen, that must be an awe-filled sight as well. God's creation invokes this sense of awe in me as I contemplate my place in the natural order, my limited space in God's good creation. The word awe, A-W-E, literally means to be filled with reverential respect, fear, wonder, or inspiration. And the word awesome means filled with awe. Now, in modern cultural slang, the word awesome has actually lost some of its awe. Many people, myself included, toss the word awesome around a bit carelessly, using it as a gap filler in conversation or an easy but empty qualifier. I had a steak the other day that I said was awesome. To tell you the truth, it did not really inspire me with reverential respect, fear, wonder, or inspiration. It was a really good steak. It was cooked medium rare just the way I like it, but it wasn't really awesome. Being filled with awe, being filled with reverential respect, fear, wonder, or inspiration, what else in our lives fills us with awe? Perhaps it is the birth of a child, holding that child in your arms and contemplating the purpose and passion of life. Perhaps it is the wisdom of a mentor or someone you hold dear in your life, a father, a mother, or others who inspire you with their insight. This past weekend was an awe-filled time for the Missouri Mid-South Conference as we gathered together to hear wisdom from Ginny Brown Daniel, Reverend Daryl Goodwin, who was our guest speaker, and our conference leadership, including our own John Brocky. Daryl Goodwin was our guest. He is an associate conference minister serving in Nebraska, and he challenged us with his stories. He told us of his call to ministry and his challenge, the challenges of a new church start. He was the founding pastor of Liberation United Church of Christ in Seattle, Washington, and he spoke of how the Holy Spirit led them through their growth. His theme centered around testimony, challenging us to make our lives living testimonies to God's awesome power, awesome goodness, and God's awesome grace. Liberation United Church of Christ grew under his leadership, not because of his abilities, he humbly implied, but because of their willingness to be open to the Holy Spirit moving within them. They were open to the awesome power of God, and that awe inspired them to work wonders. We also heard very awe-inspiring testimonies from Courtney Chandler and Sydney Bergner, our two conference youth leaders. Exemplifying Reverend Goodwin's challenge to testify, they offered testimonies about how they've been available to the youth in our conference, including challenging and inspiring them and responding to the challenges and needs in their lives. Cindy and Courtney are both contract workers with their terms ending this summer, but their inspiring testimony led the conference to overwhelmingly authorize the formation of a permanent youth leader position, youth ministry position in our conference. Their testimony was a key factor in this mandate. Their stories filled us with awe. This sense of awe that I'm speaking of this morning is what I imagine the disciples must have felt that day as the Holy Spirit invaded the place where they were gathered and filled them up with reverential respect, fear, wonder, and inspiration. This sense of awe invaded them and transformed them into something more. And that inspiration led them to be change agents in God's world. Inspired by God, they began to do new things, spreading the gospel message to all who would hear in languages that were spoken and even those that were unspoken for years. Their awe-filled inspiration was the beginning, the birth date of the church, and they grew into the potential that God instilled within them. So journey with me, if you will, back to that day when the disciples were gathered, and let's think about what took place. Traditionally, this is 10 days after Jesus ascended to heaven, 50 days after Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' friends were gathered together to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, as it is called in Greek, Pentecost. I know I mispronounced that, but Dr. Brocky's not here to hear me, so. That's right. Pentecost was a Jewish holiday before the events we heard about in Acts 2. The Holy Spirit did not create Pentecost for the Christian church. Pentecost as a holiday already existed. Pentecost, or Shavuot, as it is more properly called in Hebrew, is a festival with several foci, but paramount among them is the recognition of God's gift of the commandments for the Jewish people. According to tradition, after the Passover event and the exodus out of Egypt, the people of Israel wandered through the desert for a time until they reached Mount Sinai, where God gave Moses the 613 commandments, including the top 10 that we talk about most frequently. Jewish traditions place this event 50 days after Passover, and they call it Pentecost. So the Jewish people were already celebrating this holiday long before Acts 2, the events that we list in Acts 2. And that's why the disciples, who, like Jesus, were all Jewish, were gathered in that upper room that day. Was this the same upper room that they had gathered in 50 days prior on Passover when Jesus washed their feet, broke the bread and poured the wine, and gave them the great commandment to love one another even as he first loved them? Was it the same upper room where they had gathered 50 days prior when Jesus said the words that Peter read this morning from our gospel lesson, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments? And I will ask God, and God will give you another advocate, a helper, to be with you forever. This is the Holy Spirit of truth. This Holy Spirit, whom God will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you." Perhaps it was that same upper room, gathered for the same purpose, to remember the awe-filled events in their Jewish history and remember how God inspired their ancestors to be the people of God. So here they were. They were in a room, even if it wasn't the same room, remembering God's gift of commandments, remembering God's gift of relationship that was symbolized through those commandments, remembering that gift of relationship that God filled them with reverential respect, wonder, and inspiration, remembering Moses, who was the vessel by which that respect, wonder, and inspiration was delivered, remembering that God had delivered them through the Exodus event and then didn't abandon them, but continued to guide them through the Pentecost event. They were gathered, remembering God's awe-filled power in the stories of their traditions. And then, something happened. God's Holy Spirit blew through the room on a rush of the wind. Acts 2 tells us that the Holy Spirit blew not like a calm and gentle spring breeze, but it was a violent wind. A violent wind with tongues of fire, and the fire rested on each person gathered, and that fire acted as a crucible, transforming them into something more. God's power opened up the potential that was inside each one of them, and that potential allowed them to do great things. And then they did. After being transformed, after being inspired by God's holy fire, the disciples went out and, as Reverend Darrell Goodwin exhorted us at our conference annual gathering, they testified. They offered testimony to God's goodness and grace, to the wisdom of Jesus Christ, who inspired them for so long, and to the possibility for transforming the world into something more. So Pete stopped reading at verse 13 in our Acts chapter 2 story. But if he would have kept on reading, we would have heard from yet another Peter. We would have heard from the Peter that walked with Jesus, the rock on whom the church was built. Filled with the awesome power of God's Holy Spirit, fired up with reverential respect, fear, wonder, and inspiration, Peter went on to testify. And he testified in a sermon that was so awe-filled that having heard it, 3,000 people were converted to follow Jesus. Think about that. 3,000 people decided to follow the way of Jesus that day because of an awe-filled sermon given by a blue-collar fisherman who decided one day to follow an itinerant preacher. 3,000 people who gave up the narcissism of the world and chose instead to live as Jesus advocated. 3,000 people who chose to put aside their hatred, their fears, their prejudices, and their biases, and instead love one another just as Jesus first loved them. And if we continue to read on in Acts chapter 2, verses 43 through 47, we hear that this community goes on to form the perfect church. We hear that awe filled everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This section from Acts chapter 2, verses 43 through 47 is the vision of the perfect church, and it happened because of an awe-filled sermon preached by Peter, not Peter Jaber, the other Peter, who allowed himself to be filled with such reverence, wonder, and inspiration by God's Holy Spirit. If you want to know how to live, how to be in community, read that section of Acts, chapter 2, 43 through 47. This vision, this community, was open to being filled with reverential respect by God's Holy Spirit. But then there were those who sneered and said, they are filled with new wine. I feel that we are living in an age where sneering has replaced awe. We are a society of naysayers, skeptics, and people who will create any false narrative that suits their purpose, even if it disenfranchises others, or is baseless or untrue. This is the world we live in. We are skeptical. We don't trust anyone. We cower in fear. We build political blockades against God's children because they look different than us, vote differently, or because we don't understand their sexual orientation or gender identity. We don't let ourselves be awe-filled or inspired because we already know it all and we're jaded. God has nothing new to show us. But even in the midst of the jaded and hate-filled environment our world has become in this century, God's Holy Spirit is knocking at the door. God's Spirit is waiting to fill us with wonder, inspiration, and awe. God's Holy Spirit is waiting to do a new thing in our lives, transforming us so that we too, like Peter and those first century disciples, can be agents of change, agents of peace, agents of challenge, agents of hope in a world that so desperately needs to hear that message. I think it's important to remember that this event, this Holy Spirit event, took place while the disciples were celebrating the Jewish holiday of remembrance of God's commandments to them. They were celebrating the relationship that God established with them through the Mosaic covenant received on Mount Sinai. And while they were celebrating their relationship with God, that's when God did a new thing. They were remembering, and God was renewing. Remembering covenant, renewing covenant. This event didn't just happen one day. It happened while they were celebrating all that God had already done. So are you open to God's transforming power in your life? Are you willing to put aside the things that keep you away from God and open yourselves to God's Holy Spirit? Are you ready to put aside narcissism, skepticism, distrust, and be filled with reverential respect, fear, wonder, and inspiration? Are you ready to stop being awful and start being awe-filled? God's Holy Spirit is waiting for us all. Amen.